Hi, everybody. Good morning, Vancouver. I am so glad to be here. You know why? Because I can actually breathe the air. Every morning when I wake up, I actually check my phone in Shanghai for the air pollution levels to see whether or not my children need to wear a mask to go out and play. On some days, the pollution outside my window can be this bad. It can go beyond the measurable index, beyond 500. It might even reach 1,000, which is a true airpocalypse. Did you know that in Brussels, when the air levels go to 50, they actually stop all of the car traffic? You may or may not care that an 8-year-old girl gets cancer from nearby coal plants in China, but you should, because pollution crosses borders. China's problem is everybody's problems. What this means for climate change and you is that the decisions China makes in the next several years on how it powers its country, on how we urbanize, on how we restructure our economy, are all going, oops, it's playing by itself. The decisions that China makes in the next several years are going to affect the world in the next several thousand. Xina's emissions are growing alarmingly fast. Within a decade, China's emissions are going to double the US. Qiu Baoxing, one of China's leading visionaries in green buildings, probably said it best when he said that China is at war with energy. Actually, the world is at war with energy, and China is the battlefield. I would probably go a step further and say that China is probably the only battlefield that matters right now. To win this battle for the world, China needs everyone to join in and help turn the tide on its emissions. All right? Okay. The reality is that China's energy consumption and emissions are much larger than they were 2 decades ago. Sorry. And they're going to continue to grow very fast. This is because China is undergoing an unprecedented rate of urbanization, one that's only going to stop in about 15 years. In a 20-year time frame, China is going to have 350 million people move into cities. And this is what I call the largest animal migration the world has ever seen. Until then, China is going to construct 2 billion square meters a year. That's equivalent to the entire the entire building stock of Canada. And we're going to build 50,000 new skyscrapers, or 10 New York cities in new floor space. So China is building dense urban cities like this one, Chengdu's great city, because urbanization is the key to helping China move from survive to thrive, to helping children not have to walk 3 hours to school from dark to dark, and not having 61 million children left behind so their parents can go to the cities to find jobs. And all we want is a moderately comfortable life by Western standards. We want to move from survive to thrive. Li Junfeng, one of China's top sustainable development advocates, likens China to a teenager, except China is no ordinary teenager. It's actually a teenage Yao Ming. You can't simply cap Yao Ming's growth in order to cap emissions. That's like feeding Yao Ming 1 bowl of noodles when he really wants to eat 3. So the disposable income of a Chinese person today is just 1/10 of an average American. And that's a lot better than in 2000 when it was 24 times difference. To improve the living standards without increasing emissions, China must make some radical changes on a scale that no other country has done before in a time frame that's nearly impossible. So in other words, China is going to have to run a marathon at a sprinter's pace for the next couple of decades. We need to make 2 radical changes. The first is to decouple energy from economic growth. Now, Sweden has done this before successfully, but it's obviously on a much smaller scale and much higher per capita income. The second thing that we need to do is to decouple emissions from electricity generation. Without capping emissions, China is currently on track to equal US per capita emissions in the next decade. I can't tell you what a disaster this will be if this happens. So the decisions that China makes in the next several years will really determine whether or not we're in a climate safe zone or a climate disaster zone. And the problem is that coal pretty much equals emissions today in China. So to kick the coal habit that we've been addicted to for the last several decades, we need to revamp infrastructure significantly. And that's going to take decades in order to get off coal at a scale that really matters. So the good news is that China is already the largest investor in renewable energy. And on top of that, we have 28 new nuclear power plants that are being built. We are doing some fantastic programs like pouring $277 billion into air pollution, just 3 pilots alone, $330 billion on water pollution. Now just compare that to the $1 billion that the US announced for a climate resiliency fund. So I think that the thing that I've learned over the last 7 years working at JUICE might be something that will shine a light, a pathway forward for China and also for the world. So China has 6 unique advantages that allow it to become a green economy faster than any other country in the world. The first one is pretty obvious, and that's centralized control. So the government, even with large-scale privatization, has retained an extraordinary amount of centralized control. And this is really essential when we're making large-scale infrastructure changes. For example, the high-speed rail network that started construction in 2007, in 2012 became the largest and the fastest high-speed rail network in the world. Now compare this to the California high-speed rail that was proposed in the 80s and was started, well, actually it hasn't started yet, I don't think. In 2008, China made a decision overnight to ban free plastic bag giveaways. In the first 5 years, it eliminated 67 billion bags from use. The second characteristic is that in certain key areas, like power generation and industry, there are often only a handful of key decision makers. Now, this became really obvious to me when JUICE created the JUICE Smart Grid Cooperative, and we're trying to bring smart grid into China. And what we realized in talking to Chinese experts is that at the time, there was only 2 grid companies, it still is. Compare that to 3,200 utilities in the US. In the state grid, there's only one organization in 2007 that looked at new technologies like smart grid. That's called CEPRI. In CEPRI, there was only 2 people that actually talked to foreigners, Hu Xuehao and Bai Xiaoming. And so by surrounding these people with the support from a coalition, we paved the way for China to invest $7 billion, the first tranche of money, into building a smart grid. So China is not just a communist party, it's actually a multinational corporation. The interesting thing about this is that on an urban level, for example, the mayor and the party secretary are equivalent to a CEO and a chairman of a board. And they are judged on things like environment as a key performance indicator. That's how they get promoted. The third characteristic that Chinese has is that it's very willing to learn from others. So this is something that's very deeply ingrained into our psyche, and you can tell because if you go to a school, a private school, they're more willing to pay for a foreign teacher than for a Chinese-looking teacher. So these are just some of the coalitions on the ground in China that are working on big efforts to shift climate change in China. These coalitions need your support. China knows that it doesn't have enough solutions. It knows that it's not innovative enough. It knows that it's not efficient. So to really run a marathon at a sprinter's pace, it's going to need people from outside to come into China and help. The fourth one is very surprising, that the Communist Party is really willing to experiment at large scale. So in fact, if you look at one example, they're now testing carbon emissions trading schemes to set prices for carbon in 7 regions. This is just the first tranche of pilots. So what it's doing is it's taking commercially viable solutions from around the world, deploying them in multiple cities, and if one of them hits the center, it can scale it across the nation as a model. What this is going to do with economies of scale is going to bring down prices so that sustainable solutions are affordable for the rest of the world. So China has actually moved from just being the factory of the world to becoming the clean tech laboratory of the world. Now, this is not radical innovation like Silicon Valley. This is what I like to call tweak-evasion. Because of tweak-evasion, though, China, in 20 years, you're going to think, well, maybe it's not just the chief polluter anymore, it's now the chief solutions provider. The fifth advantage is that China's really willing to change. In the last 30 years or so, every 5 years, China's practically a new country, from internet to infrastructure, from food to fashion. So what this provides us an opportunity to do is to take the 800 million emerging middle class and help move them from these candied images of gold toilets and Kim Kardashian bling dreams and move them to a China dream, to what Chinese really want, which is being able to spend time with our loved ones, our family and friends. The sixth one is that China is highly motivated. The story of climate change is not centered around polar bears, right? It's about near-term Chinese interests. The first one is that pollution is really bad, as Gavin mentioned earlier. We're desperately looking for solutions today. And this makes our cities barely livable. It really threatens social stability, and it threatens our better city, our better life, and our hope for a China dream. The other one is that China, unlike the US, has far fewer resources to support 4 times the amount of population. And so if we don't become a more resource-efficient and energy-independent nation, this is going to threaten our economic stability and our national security. This is it's great motivation for us to go and do most of the things that are necessary to tackle climate change on the ground. So you might think that China's problems are too large to solve, or that you as one person can't make a difference. But what I've just shown you is that change can happen at gigascale. China's the only country in the world that's building new countries at a time and mastering change at gigascale. And so because of these 6 advantages, in contrast to the rest of the world, where change requires broad-based consensus, China can actually make small, precise, focused interventions, what I call acupuncture points. This is sort of a general map of what I like to call the most important acupuncture points. A lot of work is already being done on the ground in China, like at the Sino-Finnish Tongji Center, Sino-Finnish Center at the Tongji University working on designing dense, livable cities, or Lawrence Berkeley National Lab working on energy efficiency for a heavy industry. But these coalitions are not enough. They need your support. I think one of the most interesting things that I've learned at JUICE is that the coalitions that are most effective in China have 4 things. One is it's not just technologies that are being imported into China, that they have integration experts that know how to apply these technologies into a pathway that makes sense for China. And cultural bridges, because the culture of China is really 180-degree opposite of the West. Now you might think, well, I don't know much about China, I don't know much about technology, but if you know how to run teams, if you know how to help diverse teams be more effective, we could use your help on the ground, collaboration coaches. And what I'd like to tell my team at JUICE is that half the value of these coalitions is how to tell the story of the big shift so that all the stakeholders are really excited. So, in conclusion, maybe you're thinking that it takes a large nation to make this happen, that it's going to take superhuman effort. But it doesn't take 1.3 billion people to make this happen. It only takes a few passionate individuals working on some strategic coalitions on the ground with very few decision makers to make transformative change that just may save the world. So if you are frustrated wherever you are about the slow progress the world is making on climate change or pollution, why aren't you in China yet? Come to China, support us, or bring your time and your resources. If I were to have one wish, that would be that you in this audience would be to do exactly that. Join one of these coalitions or start your own here. Because nowhere else in the world can we make so much progress together so fast. So I invite you to join me before it's too late. But as I've shown you, there is a light at the end of this path, and that light, I hope, will start with you. Thank you very much.